In this lecture, I want to give the character of Japan when we look at it historically. In the following lecture, which is really, I divided up into 3 mini lectures, we're going to look at timeline. We're going to give kind of the details of how history develops, particularly how humans engage in society and culture. And then as we move into the religions over the next month or so, we're going to be diving more deeply into various parts of the history where those moments are important. And we'll also use like a map in the next lectures because you want to get a sense of the land and where things are. And so I used the map of the capitals, but there could have been other ways of doing that. Instead, I want to get to in this lecture to the character. Like, what is the personality of Japan when it comes to its history and its people? What is the tang, the flavor? Right? That's what we want to get to. And so I thought the best way to do that would be to begin with land and name. Okay? So here is a picture of Japan. Somebody did a little map of Japan, and as well as the kanji, the Japanese characters for the name. Now, we say Japan, that's an anglicized version of Nippon or Nihon. And it really combines 2 Chinese characters, 2 kanji. One is the sun, this kind of boxy thing here. It looks like a 3x5 window you might find in a bedroom in Canada. And then the second one is hon, which means it's a word for book that we would use today. You can actually see it looks like a tree that's been cut down. So the idea of a book is there, but also can have the idea of origin or foundation or base. And so we bring together 2 kind of words, sun or day, as well as, daytime, as well as like origin, foundation, base, especially book or story, okay? So those are the 2 words that we bring together. And so really we get in the Japanese name the story of the sun, right? The origins of the day, something like that. Dawn would be a simple way of doing that. So it's the land of the rising sun. It's how people in the West have sometimes called Japan. We see Japanese identity as being on the edge of the world, but also the beginning of life. And so we want to hold those 2 things together. They're both tucked into Japanese identity. And so we want to make them work together as I tell the story of Japan's history. Now, because place is so important for Japanese people, some people want to tell Japan's history by looking at the geological history. This is so far from anything I know about. I mean, like, I know that earthquakes happen, and I have a sense on why that is, but I don't really understand that. And so I'm going to mostly leave this to you. However, there is something neat about Japan and where it sits in the world. It was once part of the Eurasian supercontinent. Like, so it was once attached to the continent that has now drifted away from it. Titanic oceanic shifts caused Japan to pull away into the Pacific Sea, and it created the Sea of Japan, or the Korean Sea, if that's your perspective. This was about 15 million years ago, so pretty new. It used to be just a lake. So it used to be just a lake, and then it pulls away and creates this kind of new world. Right? Japan sits on what is, I think this is an awesome title, is called the Pacific Ring of Fire. If you look at this pink ring right there. And that's because it's got huge numbers. It's a 40,000 kilometer, it's almost a circle. You can see it doesn't quite come back together at the Pacific Antarctic Ridge. But it sits there, and it's just filled with volcanoes, trenches, earthquake, fault lines, tectonic plate movements. That's the constant shift has caused like the 4 major islands and dozens of minor islands of Japan to emerge and to create their character shape about 2 million years ago. And about that time, the Strait of Tartary and the Korean Strait opened up, and so once again dividing this place. In human history, the long East Asian archipelago that comes down all the way along here, right? This all the way along the edge of this isn't, obviously it's an older continental map, but along that edge, there's thousands of islands that exist there, make up the 6,851 islands of Japan. And actually that's now 6,852 because recently the volcanic Nishino-shima rose up from the sea nearly 1,000 kilometers south of Tokyo. Okay, and that's pretty cool. So a brand new island in Japan. They've got more land than they had before. Japan's the largest island country in its region and the fourth largest in the world behind Papua New Guinea. And Madagascar, which are slightly larger, and Indonesia has a collection of 17,504 islands and is nearly 6 times the size of Japan. Though Indonesia's population is double Japan, that makes Japan much more dense if you consider all the islands together. Though it's not as dense as island nations like Singapore, which some of our students have come for, which has 7,615 people in every square kilometer. Now, I decided to create, because space is important, a comparison. Japan and Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island and Japan. Let's compare them. And of course, when you compare their sizes, we see that Japan is 66 times as big as PEI. That's right, 66 times as big as Prince Edward Island. In global rank, Japan is 7th in the world, and PEI is 104th. And of course, intriguingly, PEI is 104th. That means that Prince Edward Island is only the 22nd biggest island in Canada, even though we're one of the 10 major provinces. Isn't that kind of weird? And Canada has 2 islands in the top 10 in the world, 3 in the top 20, 5 in the top 30, 11 in the top 50, and 20 in the top 100. So we're a big island nation, Canada is, although we don't have as many islands as Indonesia or Japan. Japan is 13 times as long as PEI, being 3,000 kilometers long. PEI only 225 kilometers, which you can bike from tip to tip in a single day if you work on it. Japan has 6,852 islands, as I said. PEI only has 27 islands, so that means there's 253 times as many islands. The population in Japan, close to 125 million. PEI of just above 150,000, so that's 800 times the population as PEI. But population density isn't quite as dramatic. The population density of Japan is 337 people per square kilometer, where in PEI is 25, so 14 to 1. And PEI is Canada's most dense province, population-wise. Per capita, it's actually not that difference in U.S. dollars. It's $38,000 per person in Japan, and then $27,000 in Prince Edward Island. So just a 1.4 to 1 ratio there. Now, where does Prince Edward Island get distinguished? Redheads. That's right. Red-headed hair. Prince Edward Island has 800 redheads for every 100,000 people. So we have about 1,250, 1,275 redheads in Prince Edward Island, whereas Japan really only has 1 redhead for every 100,000 person. It's pretty rare for a Japanese person to have real red hair that they've been born with. But on the other hand, Japan has far more karaoke bars. Karaoke, there are 100,000 karaoke bars in Japan and only 2 in PEI. So look at that ratio, 50,000 to 2. That's distinctive. That's totally distinctive. Now, that's 2 different ways that we can look at Japan. A comparison or the historical geological way. There's also anthropology and looking at this map here, and you can find this kind of thing online. What this map does is it looks at Japan from the movement of goods and the way that people's interrelated over the last 20,000 years or so in the region of Southeast Asia. Okay, and we look at and we find out, where ceramics develop and jewelry and things like that, and how agriculture develops. Those are the kind of things. So you can look at that. There's these cultural zones that existed in East Asia and anthropological history, and so you can take a look at those sorts of things if you like. So those are ways that you can look at Japan's history. However, I want to tell you the real way. Really the most important way, I think, when it comes to understanding the character of Japan and who the people are. And so I want to do this by telling the real story from the Tenji Kaibyaku. This is a creation story from both the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, and I've adapted it a little bit just for our particular use. But you can find this in a lot of sources as well. So, in the beginning, At the first moment that anyone can remember really anything happening, the world was this chaotic wilderness, void of shape. In the whirling chaos, the elements began to settle, sifting weight and light and speed, ultimately dividing the heavens and the earths. In that sifting of creation, the gods emerged. And in the heavens, as they separated from the earth, there were 7 generations of deities that were born. The Kamiyo Naneo, including 10 deities. These were 5 male gods and their younger sisters, which became their wives. Among them were 2 gods that we're going to talk about. Izanagi no Mikoto, he who invites, and his younger sister, Izanami no Mikoto, she who invites. And that's what this story is about. Izanagi and Izanami, to use their shorter names, stood upon the floating bridge of heaven. And the bridge's name is Ame-no Kihashi. And they stared down to the primeval ocean of the earth. They desired to stir up the waters of the deep, and were given Ame no Nuboko, the jeweled spear of heaven. And they stirred the sea below with their heavenly weapon. And as they lifted the spear from the sea, drops of salt water formed the first island, Onogoro. Well, Izanami and Izanagi decided to descend to Onogoro, upon which they built a pillar in the midst of the palace. And they wanted that palace to be their marital home, for their companionship in creation had caused them to fall in love. To consummate their love, they had this pillar there, and they circled around the pillar, Izanagi going in one direction, and Izanami going in the other direction. And as they circled the pillar and they came around the edges and their eyes met, Izanami wished to honor her brother husband, and she cried out in praise, "My husband, how robust you are." And then Izanagi answered, "My wife, how fine you are." Well, from their union, their mating was not auspicious. A child was born, Hiruko, a son, but he was born without a frame. He was flaccid, like a leech, with no bones in his soul. And so they cast the child away by setting him on a boat of reeds and then allowing the boat to float out into the sea, where Hiruko became the Japanese god of fishing luck. Dismayed, they prayed to their parents and siblings, the other gods, and they were told that the defective child came from a disordered union. Izanagi should have spoken first, the male, not Izanami, the female. So the lovers repented and repeated the dance around the pillar, and from their union the 8 great islands of Japan were born. Awaji, Iyo, which is Shikoku, Oki, Tsukushi, which we know as Kyushu today, Iki, Tsushima, Sado, and Yamato. And Yamato is going to be important for later conversations, and is, of course, the island that we call Honshu, the main island. The Japanese archipelago, then, is among the firstborn of creation. From the early love of the welcoming gods, land is born. The Japanese land, in particular, blessed by the gods and created specially in their love. Well, Izanagi and Izanami then produced many, many offspring. Kami that came out of their love, that came from touching the elements, from stirring the matter stuff of the universe. Even footprints upon the sand would create the Kami. But there was some risk to their love and creativity. Some of the births were difficult. And this is the truth, of course, of all that is born of woman, that there is some danger there. And in giving birth to the fire god, Kagutsuchi, Izanami was overcome, dying of her burns in childbirth. Izanagi, her husband and brother, was crushed, and he buried her upon Mount Hiba, and then struck out against the fire god, Kagutsuchi. To strike at fire, of course, is to scatter it and to cause more damage, and this is what happens when Izanagi struck out at the fire god. And from the fire god's death, many different kami were born. Well, dissatisfied with his ill-gotten revenge, it didn't really work, and lonely without companionship, Izanagi crept into Yomi, the land of the dead, the underworld, which is cloaked in eternal darkness. He found Izanami and awoke her from her stupor. She was lost in the whispering of the demons that were there, and woke her with his voice. In sensing Izanami, however, their suffering only increased because she had eaten of the food of the shadow world, and its poison was already working upon her. But Izanagi begged her to come back with her to the world above, to escape the darkness of Yomi. Izanami asked for time to rest and to ready herself, bidding Izanagi not to look at her visage. Impatient with worry, after a great time, Izanagi used fire, making a torch from a comb in his hair. And then he cast the light upon his sister wife, and found that her flesh had begun to fester and to rot. Globs of pus and skin and blood hung from her body, and that globular figure then cast shadows on the first light that had ever been cast in Yomi. These horrifying shadows, these bits of dripping flesh, became new kami that were born in the first light of that dark world. Well, in cowardice and in fear, Izanagi turned and ran from the visage of his melting wife. Izanami was indignant. As her husband fled, Izanami commanded the kami demons that were born from her putrid flesh. She commanded them to chase after Izanagi and to bind him. After battling the demons of hell, Izanagi was able to escape back into the world of the living. As a curse for her faithlessness, however, Izanami said that she would summon 1,000 souls every day from the land of the living to the land of the dead. In confusion and fury, Izanagi struck back and responded that he would then create 1,500 souls every day. And such is the balance of life and death, as we understand it from the story. Izanagi, upon returning to the fresh air above, although alone, he decided to purify himself, and each drop of water and dirt that fell from him became a new kami. When he washed his face, Amaterasu, the sun, was made from his left eye, Tsukiyomi, the moon, was made from his right eye, and Susanoo, the storms, came from his nose, from his nostrils. Amaterasu, the light of the sky, became one of the most powerful gods in Japanese belief, as she danced with Tsukiyomi and battled Susanoo. Japan is, after all, the land of the rising sun, and Amaterasu blessed the race of men upon the land with her mirth. She gave them light. And the great line of emperors are among her own children. It is true that the geological, anthropological, and comparative studies can tell us one kind of story about Japan's history. But this myth tells us another story, doesn't it? Bound up into Japanese identity are all the things that are found in this story, brief it as it is. The Japanese are intimately connected to the land. There's mountains and valleys, earthquakes and storms, day and night, light and darkness, typhoons and tsunami, hot springs and rock waterfalls, and things that grow from the ground and things that die, life and death, those that are born and those that pass on. This is the great dance of dawn and darkness that the story tells, that was created by these gods. Somehow, the earliest Japanese knew that their world sat on the edge of the world, that their country was somehow the eastern edge, so that Amaterasu, as she rises each day, it is first to Japan where the light is cast, and then all nations get their light after. It's something intriguing and special. Now, you can see the characteristics of Japan in the story. We're going to move on. I'm going to use a timeline, I'm going to use a map, and you're going to hear kind of more serious history. But don't forget to look for the character that we see in these myths. Because myths aren't stories about the past, right? Myths are stories about what is true of the present, what's true of the characteristic of Japanese history. This ancient history moment is missing many things, but the mythology will always tell you what you need to know about a people and what their key questions are.